Safety Committee, and we are here to discuss a report from the Office of Legislative Oversight detailing the analysis of Data Montgomery on traffic violations data set. A lot of data in here, and so I know this is going to be a really important conversation as we think through not only road safety, but how road hazards impact our lives, not only from a pedestrian and bicyclist safety aspect, but also from a public safety and racial equity, and making sure that everybody is safe on our streets. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Chair Katz to make any opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and Mr. Chair of wearing two hats here today. I do think that as we begin, and we're going to have the Natalia from Office of Legislative Oversight actually lead us through this packet. But I do think it would be helpful if we had the people sitting in the panel, if they would please identify themselves. Commander, you're going to need to touch the, yeah, there we go.
I'm Dave McBain, Commander of the 3rd District.
Assistant Chief Mark Yamada, Chief of the Field Services Bureau.
Brian Dillman, Captain and Director of the Traffic Operations Division.
Chris Tippy, the Director of Operations for Automated Traffic Enforcement. John O'Brien, I'm the Executive Officer of the Field Services Bureau.
Thank you all for being here. Natalia, we have started, so when you get a chance to sit down, like it's in 2 seconds, I'm going to call it back to the Council President to lead us through, please.
We just did some general introductions, so we'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Good afternoon, my name is Natalia Carrizosa, and I am here to present the findings of OLO Memorandum Report 2022-12, entitled Analysis of the Montgomery County, of the Data Montgomery Traffic Violations Data Set. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to make this PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to turn it back over to the Joint Committee. Before I get started, I do want to take a moment to thank my colleagues, Jan Marie Peña and Karen Pecoraro, who provided invaluable assistance for this report. I also want to thank the MCPD staff who are available here to answer questions today and who assisted with the preparations for this work session. So to begin this presentation, I'm just going to give an overview of what we were assigned to do. Then I will talk about some background and research on racial inequities and disparities in traffic enforcement. And then going to talk about the data set that I looked at for this report, background on the data set and some limitations. Then I'll go over some trends, overall trends in the data. Next, I'm going to talk about traffic stops by residency of the driver. Then I'll talk about citations by the title and section of the Maryland vehicle law that was cited. And then finally, I'll go over OLO's findings and discussion issues. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about what we were assigned to do. The report that we're talking about today is kind of an update from an OLO report from 2020 on local policing data and best practices. That report included an analysis of MCPD traffic enforcement data from using this same data set, the Data Montgomery Traffic Violations data set. It's a public data set. From that report, based on that report, we were asked to provide some additional data points to respond to some questions that arose. And specifically, we were asked to look at 2 things. First, we were asked to look at traffic stops by the residency of the driver. So looking at whether the driver that was stopped is a resident of Montgomery County or of other jurisdictions. And then second, we were asked to look at traffic citations by the section of the Maryland vehicle law that was cited, meaning the part of the law that was violated, and also by the driver's race and ethnicity. So I'm now going to give some history and research regarding racial inequities and disparities in traffic enforcement. So first, some national and local history. In the early 20th century, police departments expanded significantly in response to both the prohibition and the advent of large-scale car ownership. Traffic law enforcement greatly expanded police interactions with average citizens. It also led to streamlined procedures that allowed police officers to effectively determine the guilt of drivers through the use of citations rather than the judicial system, although of course drivers could and can contest their citations in court. Traffic law enforcement also led to increased police powers to search drivers And by the 1930s, the NAACP began receiving complaints of violence and abuse towards black drivers. A little bit of local history as well. In 2000, the Department of Justice, Montgomery County, and the FOP entered into a 5-year memorandum of agreement to settle an allegation that county police officers engaged in racially discriminatory conduct in violation of federal law. That agreement is no longer in effect, but one of its requirements, which related to data tracking, became codified in state law, and that's why we have the data set that this report looks at. Today, national research shows that Black and Latinx drivers are stopped and searched during traffic stops for lower level traffic violations, and that refers to minor traffic violations, expired registrations, equipment issues, at disproportionately higher rates compared to white drivers, while racial disparities are smaller for collision contributing violations. I've also seen some research by the New York Times. 2021 analysis identified 400 individuals killed in encounters with police during traffic stops over a 5-year period, with black drivers overrepresented among those killed. So now I'm going to talk about the data set that this report looks at, the Data Montgomery traffic violations data set. So I mentioned earlier there was a requirement in the MOA regarding data tracking that became codified into state law. Specifically, state law requires that law enforcement officers in Maryland report information for each traffic stop they conduct, including data on the race or ethnicity of the driver. ETICS is the state's electronic system for issuing traffic citations and tracking data on traffic stops in Maryland. Data from ETICS on traffic citations, warnings, and safety equipment repair orders issued by MCPD are publicly available on Data Montgomery. So there's some limitations to this data set. The first is that data on the race or ethnicity of drivers are based on officers' observations and may not necessarily reflect how individuals self-identify. The second is that there's no data in this data set on stops that did not result in a citation, warning, or safety equipment repair order. The next is that the data set doesn't identify the specific reason or action that led to each traffic stop, and instead it lists all the violations, meaning all the citations, warnings, and safety equipment repair orders that resulted from traffic stops. But in preparation for this work session, I did consult with MCPD staff to identify which types of violations can lead to traffic stops, and that information is available in the attachment to the staff report at Circle 1. It's also going to be reflected in the tables later in this presentation. And then the last limitation is that the data set only includes data for traffic stops conducted by MCPD, so it doesn't include any data for stops conducted by municipal police departments or other agencies. I also wanted to mention another limitation of this data set and also of OLO's analysis, which is that it doesn't quantify all of the consequences for drivers of traffic stops. So these consequences can include fines, which can range from $50 to $2,000, points on a driver's license, which can result in suspension or revocation of the license, the requirement to have repairs done and the costs associated with those repairs, and incarceration, which can also be another consequence of traffic stops. And then the data set also doesn't include information on uses of force that occurred during traffic stops or injuries to drivers, police, or others that occurred during the stop. So now I'm going to provide some summary data on trends in MCPD traffic stops over time, so looking at the 5-year period from FY18 to FY22. This slide shows that traffic stops and traffic violations, which again is the sum of all of the citations, warnings, and safety equipment repair orders, declined significantly during the pandemic. As of FY22, stops and violations were at about a third of the level that they were pre-pandemic. This slide shows trends over time with regards to traffic stops by the race or ethnicity of the driver and their gender. The second column on the left-hand side shows the adult population percentages based on census data. And then the next column is the percentage of traffic stops for that group over the 5-year period. And then the following columns are the percentages for each year. Looking at the rows for black drivers, we can see that overall black drivers were overrepresented in traffic stops. Black adults account for 18% of the population, but 30% of traffic stops. If we look at these data by gender, we see that it's really black male drivers that are highly overrepresented. Black males account for 9% of the adult population, but 20% of traffic stops. Overall, among all the demographic groups, we see that black male drivers are the most overrepresented group. If we look at white drivers, white adults account for 43% of the county's adult population and 35% of traffic stops, meaning that white drivers are underrepresented in traffic stops. If we break it down by gender, we see that white female drivers are the most underrepresented demographic group, accounting for 22% of the population, but only 14% of traffic stops. And thinking now about trends over time, I mentioned in the previous slide that overall numbers of traffic stops declined between FY18 and FY22. If you look at the last column on the right-hand side, you see that racial disparities in traffic stops have persisted or worsened over the 5-year period. For example, we can see that the percentage of traffic stops where the driver was white declined by 8 points over the 5-year period. I also want to highlight that from FY18 to FY22, the percentage of traffic stops where the driver's race or ethnicity was listed as other doubled from 7% to 14%. So next I'm going to talk about traffic stops by the residency of the driver. But before I get, the request was specifically to look at residency and race or ethnicity. Before I get into that, I just want to give you the overall breakdown. Overall, traffic stops conducted over this 5-year period, the driver was a resident of Montgomery County 73% of the time, so a little bit under 3/4, and then the remaining just over 1/4 were from other jurisdictions and primarily other Maryland jurisdictions. If we look at these data by race and ethnicity, and specifically looking at the Montgomery County residents, we see pretty similar trends to what we saw when we looked at the previous table, looking at all of the stops. So we see that black drivers are overrepresented in traffic stops, and Asian and white drivers are underrepresented. If we look at the data from other jurisdictions, we see that black drivers account for 41% of traffic stops of drivers from other jurisdictions. Just to put that into context, that 41% accounts for about 1/3 of the traffic stops of black drivers in Montgomery County. So the next part that I'm going to talk about is looking at traffic citations by the title and section of the Maryland Vehicle Law. So the Maryland Vehicle Law consists of titles 11 through 27 of the Maryland State Code Transportation article, and this slide lists the 6 titles from that from the Maryland Vehicle Law that account for nearly all citations. Title 21, it refers to rules of the road, which is kind of the moving and parking violations. Title 16 refers to rules around driver's licenses. Title 13 relates to title and registration of vehicles. Title 22 is about equipment. Title 20 is accidents and accident reports, and that includes a lot of the hit and run violations. And then Title 17 is called required security, which refers to vehicle liability insurance. And what we see on this table is that citations related to rules of the road account for the majority of citations. We also see that although citations decreased during this period, the percentage that related to Title 21 increased during the pandemic, and this may be a result of the fact that the rules around the renewal of driver's licenses and registrations were suspended during the pandemic and have since been reinstated, so we can kind of see those numbers ticking back up to previous levels, just in terms of the percentages. So what we were asked to do here was to compare racial disparities in citations, and just in order to do a comparison, we calculated a disparity score for each title or section. And specifically what we did is we calculated the difference between the percentage of citations issued to each racial or ethnic group and the percentage of the adult population that belongs to that group. So for example, if white drivers accounted for 28% of citations and they represent 43% of the population, then this difference is 15 percentage points. And then I added the absolute values of these differences for each group. So when I say absolute value, I mean I just added the numbers without regard for what direction the difference was in, so that I could capture the difference itself and not have the numbers cancel each other out. And so that's how I got the final disparity score. And then the next slide kind of just gives you an example of how I did this. So these are numbers for all citations. So for all citations, Asian drivers account for 4% of all citations. Asian adults account for 16% of the population. The difference between those numbers is 12. So I did that for each group, and I added them up. So for black drivers, that difference is 16. I had 12 plus 16 plus 10 plus 15 plus 2 to get a disparity score of 55 points. Now this score doesn't mean a whole lot in and of itself. It's just a basis for comparison. One of the limitations of this score is that it doesn't highlight or take into account which groups are overrepresented and which groups are most underrepresented. So I'm going back to this list of the 6 titles of the Maryland Vehicle Law that account for most of the citations. And if you look at this table, what we see is that citations related to rules of the road, so those are moving and parking violations, had a relatively low disparity score of 44 points. In contrast, citations related to Title 16 and Title 17, so those are citations related to licenses as well as vehicle liability insurance, had relatively high disparity scores of 76 points and 77 points. So these, now I'm going to get into the tables that look at racial disparities by the specific section of the Maryland Vehicle Law that was cited. There's a lot of different sections, so there's a lot of different tables, but I'm going to go over them fairly quickly. So this particular table looks at the 12 sections of Title 21 that had at least 500 citations over the 5-year period and also had the highest disparity scores. And so what we see here is that the 4 sections of this particular title that had the highest disparity scores relate to parking or stopping where prohibited, stopping a vehicle and obstructing traffic, failing to stop or fleeing from a officer, and also improper turns. We also see that citations related to reckless driving and driving while impaired by alcohol or other substances also had relatively high disparity scores, and these also account for large numbers of citations. One thing to see, you can see that one of those sections is italicized. That just refers to the fact that those are violations that are typically identified during the traffic stop and not before. So you'll see more of those italicized sections in the next slides. This table shows the 12 sections from Title 21 with the lowest disparity scores. Just want to highlight a couple here. You'll see in the middle of the table that the section that accounts for the most citations of all of the sections is exceeding the posted speed limits, and this one has a relatively low disparity score. And then if you look at the section that has the very lowest disparity score, it relates to distracted driving using a cell phone while driving. These tables now look at the other titles of the Maryland Vehicle Law. Here on this table we see sections related to driver's licenses. As I mentioned earlier, sections related to driver's licenses have fairly high disparity scores. In Title 13, related to certificates in title and registration of vehicles, we see that citations that relate to unauthorized display and use of registration plate had the highest disparity score among those. And then here are the sections that relate to Titles 22 and Title 20. So Title 22 is about equipment, and those sections under Title 20 really relate to hit and runs. We see that under Title 22, the violations related to tail lamps have the highest disparity score among these. And then finally, Title 17, that refers to vehicle liability insurance. We see that this particular section regarding driving an uninsured vehicle has a very high disparity score, and we also see that Black drivers are highly overrepresented in terms of these citations. So finally, I'm now going to go over our findings and discussion issues, and this is really just a summary of what I've already talked about. First, overall finding is just that while numbers of traffic stops declined between FY18 and FY22, racial disparities in traffic stops have persisted or worsened over the 5-year period. The second is that data on traffic stops of drivers that reside in Montgomery County show similar racial disparities compared with data on all MCPD traffic stops. And then finally, racial disparities in traffic citations vary greatly by the specific section of the code that was cited, which is consistent with national research showing that Black and Latinx drivers are stopped and searched during traffic stops for lower level traffic violations at disproportionately higher rates compared to white drivers. And lastly, I have 2 recommended discussion issues. The first is what strategies are currently in place for assuring non-discriminatory law enforcement in connection with traffic stops. And the second is about data, what opportunities exist to improve available data on MCPD traffic stops. For example, could we capture data on race and ethnicity based on how drivers self-identify? Could the data set be expanded to identify which violations were the initial reason for traffic stops? So with that said, that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to the committee.
Thank you very much. A lot of data to digest there, and a lot of different ways that this conversation can go. And so I don't know if Assistant Chief Yamada, you have any comments, or we can just get into a dialogue. Okay. And colleagues, let me know after I go. I'll yield to the Chair of the Public Safety Committee, and then anybody else who wants to speak. The one question I have, or what the data said to me, when you're looking at the disparity scores, clearly exceeding speed limits is an equal opportunity offender, and everyone's doing it, and we got to stop people from doing it, right? You all see that, we see that, and the data that's not here are the number of people who continue to be hit and killed on our roads. And to know that everybody in the community is contributing to that is a crime in its own. And so we have to work on that. That is a different conversation. But the flip side of the disparity scores, in seeing the incredible gaps that exist for citations on driver's licenses, on certification and registration and equipment of vehicles, my question is that most of those, if not all of them, are citations that aren't seen, really. It takes another level of conversation or of inspection to get to it. And I'm watching you all as you're thinking. So the question is, walk through how somebody gets a citation for that, because I think the answer to this problem is that how they get pulled over or how that is identified. Is that a fair presumption?
So one of the things, or several of the things that I promised the county executive and the council when I first took over in this chair, middle of 2021, when we first started Central Traffic, was that we would conduct all our stops equally, meaning that a traffic stop at Fenton and Colesville would be the same traffic stop that you would get in Avenel or Poolsville. We would also spend time in all 6 districts. We are data-driven, meaning our officers, specifically the central motor officers, are sent to areas that we are given data that show our high collision areas. They are spread across all of the six districts. We spend an equal amount of time there. We rotate periodically. I think every week we change days and evenings amongst all the districts. And that we would focus on the 5 violations for conducting our stops, meaning the violations that we have seen contribute to the accidents: speed, aggressive driving, driving under the influence, DUI, aggressive driving, occupant safety. I'll let Brian go into, and the other things I promised is we would be consistent in how we conducted those stops. So once a violation is observed, you identify yourself, you explain the reason for the stop, you allow the driver to offer an explanation on why they might be speeding or failed to see that red light. You give the ticket and you explain to them it's not an admission of guilt, and they have an opportunity to come to court. I can let Captain Dillman speak to how the tickets are issued, but it's officer discretion comes into play definitely along those lines once the stop is made.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important. I think what you're getting at is traffic stops are made, and the large percentage are for rules for the road. They would be your primary stop. When that stop is then conducted, the officer is then going to do different computer checks. In the process of those computer checks, we might find out that a driver is suspended, he's revoked. We have a tag pickup order for maybe a compulsory insurance violation, which maybe they got an equipment repair order, they didn't get it taken care of, and now their registration is suspended. And we would be remiss if we didn't say, I think there is a socioeconomic component to that. There is. Some of these things involve money, and if you can't afford it, then it goes by the wayside. And then these secondary charges that you see may impact disproportionately our minority population. That is very much a factor. But yes, most of those ancillary charges aren't something that we see in the performance of making a traffic stop in the first place. It's more investigative afterwards.
So if I, AC, you might.
And one thing I would add is the places that we conduct our traffic enforcement predominantly mirror what you would see if you mapped out the equity focus areas in the county. In those areas, you're going to find the majority of the drivers are going to be from your minority communities.
So just so I'm clear, right, I'm just kind of setting the stage. A car or driver is pulled over for a rules of the road infraction, right? And after the license or registration is reviewed, then come those secondary or tertiary citations, right? Because, right, I'm just trying to understand the order because it's important to trying to figure
I think
this
you're
out.
tracking right, yeah.
Okay. One last question I have, and I don't know if the data is able to answer this or if you are. Would it be a true statement that everybody who has received a citation for driver's license or equipment in vehicles, basically anything other than rules of the road, received a citation for rules of the road first?
That one I'm not sure I understand, but so let's say.
Let me rephrase it. If somebody was pulled over for a rules of the road infraction or a perceived rules of the road infraction, and then their driver's license was handed over, the registration was handed over, any of these other citations that are below that on the list, would they have had to gotten a citation for the rules of the road for them to then get one of the others? And how many mismatches are there? And that's not an artful way of saying it.
No, you don't, one doesn't equate to the other as far as getting the citation. So I'll use an example when I was a police officer, when I actually used to work the road. I might pull you over for speeding, okay? But I might not give you a ticket for speeding. If I found something lesser that I could speak to you and say, hey, your speeding was a factor here today, that's why I pulled you over. I'm going to give you a break. Please don't speed anymore. It leads to bad things. I notice you're not wearing your seatbelt. I'm going to give you a seatbelt ticket. Instead, it comes with a lesser degree of a penalty. And as long as the interaction didn't constitute anything else, I wouldn't have addressed the initial reason I pulled you over, except to verbally, hopefully, educate you.
Understood. And clearly, I think everyone understands the reason I was asking going down this road. Is because the rules of the road seem to be one of the most equitable citations, and that is because you can see it with your eyes, you can see it with your equipment, but then it starts getting a little more subjective and trying to discern how we become more fair across the board. It gets a little muddy, and clearly that's why we're having this conversation.
I understand that, and maybe I just would like to point out, if I gave you a ticket for not having insurance or your registration is expired, that is a violation. I'm not making it up. I'm not creating it, much like I didn't create you speeding. I'm using my discretion on what I give you the ticket for, but it doesn't have to do with your race.
Thank you. Chair Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First off, before I begin, I want to thank you all for doing what you do. We always forget to do that, and I want to thank the public for being involved in this as well. It's because of all of us that Natalia had all the hard work to do, that we asked for this report to get us more information. And of course, information and communication literally are the key to success. That's what we need to do. I did want to point out that if a person is stopped, Assistant Chief Yamada, when you were a police officer, if you stop someone, I'm kidding you now, when you stop someone, there was a time that there were no video cameras. Now everybody has one in their pocket, but now every police officer, every police car has captures a video of that event. And so that would be, anytime you give a ticket today, in today's world, that would be something that if somebody says you did the wrong thing, or you know where I'm going, and that's correct. Is that?
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, Chief Jones moved within the last 2 years. We're not allowed to just give you a verbal warning. I have to then, it has to be documented in some form or fashion, every stop. So that it can't be, in fact, if I pulled you over and just let you go and didn't document anything, you turned around and for some reason filed a complaint against me, and it was, we found out that yes, the stop was made, and I didn't document it, I could be subject to discipline,
Right.
internal.
And that's to everyone's success. That's to everyone's success, because it truly verifies what did and did not happen. And people at times will say that a police officer, did something wrong, and this proves that they did or they didn't, and vice versa, that someone could say that a person did something wrong, and the video proves it. You know, we've seen an example, I guess just a couple weeks ago, Commander, of someone doing donuts in the middle of Fenton and wherever it was, and that person didn't, from what I've read, I did not get a citation, because by the time you all got there, they were gone. But certainly there was people whose lives could have easily been in jeopardy because of that very foolish act. And we've had that before. I mean, we've had less of it, thank goodness. And so in those types of instances, when we go to someone that's for DWI, if you pull somebody, well, first off, if somebody's driving without a license plate, somebody's pulling them over, whether they were speeding or not. I mean, you realize that they are breaking the law in some way. So someone's pulling them over. If someone is stopped for driving while intoxicated, there's all of these other measures that are taken care that you have to do. I mean, you say, I think you're, driving while intoxicated, but there's the field sobriety test, there's the blood test eventually, all of these other measures. Of those incidents, and we hope we have none in Montgomery County, but we have them every day. I think you have police cars that were recently struck during some of the stops. When that happens, how many people actually take that to court? I guess they all have to go to court if it's DWI. And how many are found to be in violation? And how many were found to be that they were issued incorrectly?
I don't know the statistic on that. I'm assuming you mean if you were charged with DUI, went to court, and the charge was dropped, or for whatever, I would imagine it happens periodically because an officer doesn't show up in court, or a judge might find that probable cause wasn't met, something, and you managed to get off the charge. I would imagine it's low, but I don't know the exact number.
And I don't know whether, Natalia, we've been able to capture that in the data. Whether it's, go ahead.
I don't believe that's in this data set.
And to me, if we want to be fair, and that's exactly why we're here, is because we want to be fair. Everyone wants to be fair. Then we need to, as best we can, and you know, I mean, it's a tough thing to do, but as best we can, it would be helpful for us, for all of us, to know if someone was charged incorrectly or whatever happened, or if it really was a legitimate stop, if there really was a legitimate problem. And I'm going to stop on this because I know others have things to say, but I do believe that, and I think it was Assistant Chief Yamada made this point, in the more dense areas, or Commander or Captain Dillman, in the more dense areas, you're more than likely going to have more patrols than you are in the ag reserve. That doesn't mean that you don't have speeding in the ag reserve, but you're not going to get someone calling about the donuts in the middle of at 10:30 at night. And so I think that also has to be in the reflection of the data, if we could do it, you know, where these tickets are being issued. And it would be helpful to all of us to know if there's a way that we can know, since we're looking at the racial differences, for the technology. I can tell you that am the proud owner of about 9 of them. Every time I get one, I always ask my wife, I say, were you driving my car that day? And it hasn't happened yet. It was me that did it. People hate them. I hate them, but it taught me to be more careful, which was the idea of these things. And so it would be helpful to me to know if there's what the percentages are of the date of the automated, the technology tickets versus, you know what I'm saying?
Sure, yes, and unfortunately, I should have mentioned in my presentation that any tickets related to speed cameras or red light cameras are not available in this data set.
Would you be able to get them from some? You have to get them from the state of Maryland, I guess.
I'll defer to MCPD, but my understanding is that's not.
Everybody keeps pointing on this down the line. There's going to be somebody in Rockville City Hall that's going to be answering this soon. Go ahead.
No, because there's so many differences on who the registered owner is. There's multiple registered owners for vehicles. You can rent out your own personal vehicle. Rental car companies have a certain, if you lease a car versus if you're leasing a car, depends on the time frame. So it's really hard to track who is actually issued those citations as to who the driver was.
Gotcha. Thank you. I'm yielding back. Thank you all for helping me.
Thank you. Councilmember Balcom.
Sure, thank you. So I just, similar to President Glass, do we know the number of stops versus the number of violations?
Yes, and I can show you
I believe Captain Dillman has some information on the number of stops that were conducted by, and when we say number of stops, I think he broke it down by, we have 26 central traffic officers who I think they accounted for a little over 38% of the total stops done in the county. And then you have the other, however many police officers there are, who did the remaining stops.
So I can tell you, 2019, as an agency, and this was before our central traffic unit, we conducted 106,080 traffic stops. 2020, 39,315, drastic decrease. In 2021, we established our central traffic unit in July of 2021. They had 9,370 stops and accounted for 25.7% of the stops. Again, was not established until July. All other officers had 27,089 traffic stops for a total of 36,459. And 2022 total traffic stops for an agency was 35,944. The central traffic unit accounted for 13,886 of those, which is 38.6%.
I was going to say, and I have pointed this out before, but I take every advantage to try to allow the members of the council to digest and whenever I have this conversation. But of those 13,800 traffic stops that were conducted by our officers, when you talk about racial disparities and things like that, I fielded a total of 3 complaints during that same time frame. 1 was unfounded, and 2 were a courtesy violation that was complained about against the officer. There were no allegations of, hey, you stopped me because of this, or I didn't, anything like that. So that's, to me, is pretty good. It's telling you that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing the way we're supposed to be doing.
Appreciate that. Thank
Other
you.
thing I'd like to add too is that our central traffic last year for the traffic stops, 67.51% of those stops were for speeding, of which the vast majority of those would have been through LiDAR. And many times, there's absolutely no way when you're hitting someone with a laser from 500,000 feet away that you know what the race of the driver is at that point in time.
So I guess, and thank you. It would be interesting to know how many stops, or like the average number of citations. So a lot of stops, there are no citations, right? And then, or there has to be a warning of some sort.
So what we can share, I believe Captain Tillman has these statistics too, but we issued, when I say we, the central traffic officers, again, 40% of your stops, we issued 3 times as many warnings as we did citations.
Yeah, I did not bring exact numbers, but yeah, we're
No,
about
that's okay.
80-20 in terms of citations to warnings.
I think the getting back to the crux of how many citations for like the Title 16 infractions that did not have a corresponding Title 22 either citation or warning, because the citations don't include the warnings. Do we have data on the warnings?
So, yes, this data set does have information on the warnings. And I don't know if this fully responds to your question, but in the report I do have some additional tables, one of which shows that there were an average of 1.8 violations for every stop. So a violation is a warning, a safety equipment repair order, or a citation. I also did crunch the numbers before the work session as kind of part of looking into what are the reasons for stops, and I looked at for each section, what percentage of those citations had another violation associated with it. I don't have that data in front of me right now, but I can certainly send it over to you after the work session.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I think that looking at the warnings adds to the data as opposed to just the citations.
Can I just add one thing? It's one small part of this, but for the violation of DUI violation, you have to understand that a police officer is issuing 3 citations for the same violation. So typically you'll see 4 violations for every DUI stop, but that's how the state's attorney's office operates. They want us to do all the charges underlining so that they can choose, and then they have the option of a plea bargain. Mm-hmm. But it makes a difference when 4 citations are coming out when it's really just the 1 violation.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
And then to go along with Captain Dillman's comment on the laser or the LiDAR not being unable to ascertain the race of the driver prior to the stop is, I don't know that the data takes into account the number of stops that are done in the evening or nighttime hours. It'd be impossible for somebody to tell the race of the driver.
That wasn't part of this analysis. There is a recent study from California that I believe showed that there were higher racial disparities when there was daylight. So that's something that's available in the national research, but I haven't done that analysis with this data set.
Thank you, Councilmember Balcom. I agree with you that there's a lot more many more crosstabs that could be analyzed to further advance some of this work. And Commander McBain, you answered the question I was just going to ask, looking at this chart as to why there are so many more violations than stops, and you said that one stop could result, or clearly does result, in many more violations. Thank you. Councilmember Stewart.
Great, thank you for this and this report. I just have a couple of clarifying questions first to make sure I'm understanding the data. So I just wanted to confirm, because in the report it says that there's, we're not looking at on these charts what led to the stop, right? Correct. Correct. So, but it also says in the report that the 2001 state law said that's what should be collected, is what led to the stop. So I guess my question is, why aren't we looking at that?
So 2 points. One, first answer is I'm not sure why that's not in this data set. I know that it is something that is required by law to be collected in e-tics, but I know that it's not something that I can see in this data set because it literally just lists all of the citations and and warnings and safety equipment repair orders. The other answer to your question is in the packet, the attachment does have a list of all of the sections, and it identifies which sections are ones that can be reasons for stops. So that offers a little bit of an answer, but there are certainly situations where there could be some ambiguity.
No, and I think given the responses we've had today, what actually leads to looking at the difference between, the low level versus the high level is important. And I would ask the chairs that if this isn't in the data set, that this may be something, and if it's out of compliance with the 2001 state law, that this is a letter that we can send and inquire as to why.
Can I provide a little insight?
Absolutely.
So our database is a state database. Delta Plus is a platform, e-tics is within that. The problem we have is if you issue a violator multiple citations, it automatically defaults back to the first one. So you don't know exactly what the primary reason was or initial reason was for the stop. So it is a state database issue that doesn't fall on us, so that's something that the state would have to clean up for us to get that data.
Exactly, and that's why I've asked the chairs that it would be appropriate for us to contact the state, because it seems that the state is out of compliance with the 2001 state law, which then limits the analysis that we can do locally on this. So
Another thing, while you're fighting the fight that I think was important,
I'm ready.
You have a couple more things for us to put in there?
doesn't identify race at all, or accident reports. So when it comes to those involved in fatal collisions or accidents, period, we can't capture that data. And I think that'd be critical.
Yeah.
Natalia, you making a note of that too, that we could,
Yeah.
Captain Dillman has anything else you would like us to include in that, please let us know. I know he's shy. He's very shy.
The other thing I wanted to confirm, I think it says in the report, and I want to make sure I understood this correctly, that we don't collect data from stops using radar, laser. So, and I know, again, going back, that we're basing this on the state law from 2001, but given the prevalence now of license plate readers, handheld and mounted, are we picking up stops based on that technology? And so that's I'm just
one of the exemptions.
I'm just going to say, and this isn't a reflection of you all, but that's huge, because I know from doing my own ride along that assisted, like a lot of the stops, I would say, vast majority are being done after a license plate reader has been used, clocked somebody, and then they're being pulled over for that, and we're not capturing any of those. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd let Lieutenant O'Brien go.
We are capturing that data.
Okay.
What we're referring to is the data that gets reported to the Maryland Automation Center, the race-based tracking does not capture the LiDAR, the license plate readers, the DUI checkpoints. So the data is captured, but in terms of what the state requires, it's not there. To Captain Dillman's point a moment ago, this is not our program, this is the state police program.
Get it.
And in compliance with state police, they are requiring all of the race-based information for all traffic stops. They do not require it for all of our collision reporting. As you can imagine, we've dealt with a lot of cultural and community groups that have lots of questions about where their members fall and how that impacts their community. And we are not able to provide that information. And so we are somewhat limited in terms of, the data when we don't control the system. This is a system that is used throughout the state.
I completely understand that, and my questions are merely for clarification, because what I'm going to ask also is when we contact the state, that I believe, and this may require a change in state law to update it, knowing that this law was written in 2001 and the license plate reader technology was vastly different 2 years ago than it is right now. And we need to make sure our state laws are keeping up with technology. Not a reflection on you, but what the state law is and what ETICS is collecting. And so I just wanted to clarify that as well. And while we're on it, on page 7 and on page 7 and 8, and this is the original report. Sorry that I'm working off not the packet. But there were a number of other items that, if we are contacting the state regarding kind of like the duration of stop, as we talked about before, that was raised, use of force, other things that they're, questioning why aren't we collecting those data, and maybe the need to do that as well. So my question to you all now, after I got done with the state, is saying now that we have a central traffic officers, as you've talked about, and knowing that we are seeing disparities in these issues, are there things that you all have put in place since we have a central traffic officers, any additional trainings or other things specifically to look at this issue of the disparities in stops?
So I'll comment on the first one. I mean, one of the big things that we're doing as a department, and it's not just for the central, is implicit bias training, both in the academy and in service, extensively. A big emphasis on that.
Yeah, so I think as an agency, it starts from the very first day that they enter the academy. I always call it the bricks, but we have part of our honor code statement says that it is my duty to obey the law and to enforce it without any consideration of class, color, creed, or condition. From there, our traffic laws or criminal laws are all taught. We enforce those based on the violation, not the race of the violator. Our function code 1000, which deals with traffic stops, it has a specific section there, race-based traffic stops, so as officers will not stop or detain any individual based on exclusively on their race, ethnicity, or national origin, unless this information relates to a specific lookout regarding a suspect's physical description concerning a criminal investigation or other legitimate law enforcement action. We all wear body-worn cameras, as you guys know. The requirement in our departmental directive for that is they have to be activated for every traffic stop, period, for the entirety of the stop. We just recently implemented a unit where we have 2 sergeants, and their whole role is they randomly review our body-worn camera footage to make sure that officers are in compliance with all the departmental directives. As the chief said, we have implicit bias training, which even the ELEFA report gave us credit for doing. So they are all the things we're doing internally, and like we said, I think our number or lack thereof of complaints is very telling. People aren't making allegations that we're stopping them based on the color of their skin. It's more courtesy type complaints. One thing that we do, and it was so critical in getting this central traffic unit established, was all of our deployments are data driven. So they are all going to our high injury networks because we want to combat the problem that we have with fatal traffic accidents. The unfortunate part is, and why I think we see some of the disparities in terms of numbers is, those always marry up with the urban areas. They always marry up with our economic focused areas. So it is very conceivable that we are conducting more traffic stops on our minority population. Additionally, when you talk about the district traffic stations that are conducting traffic stops, they're conducting most of those stops where our calls for service are. Those calls for service also marry up with where our economic focused areas are. Unfortunately, that is the way it is. And so there was an interesting line that they came out of the Stanford report, and it's good that I have actually highlighted, and just let me find it here. But it's actually referring to Philadelphia, and it says, while these baseline stats give us a sense that there are racial disparities in policing practices, and they reference Philadelphia, they are not evidence of discrimination. And I think that's a key factor here. Because these disparities exist doesn't mean it's discrimination. There's discriminatory on the part of our officers at all.
And I hesitate, but, the OLO report itself is based a lot on census data. I think that would be a flawed way to do it. I just,
Say more. No, I'm not following you.
I think basing a lot of what the OLO's findings are, in general, they're what they look at is census data. I think it makes this report inherently flawed in a lot of ways.
And if I can just add to that, 26.94% of our traffic stops last year were for out of state or out of county residents, of which, this is critical, 5 of the zip codes that led that charge in last year, 4 were Prince George's County, and 1 was the District of Columbia. So when you look at the demographics of both PG County, blacks consist of 59.1%, Hispanics 21.2%. District of Columbia, blacks 40.9%, Hispanics 11.2%. So there are a lot of viable reasons as to why there might be those disparities in our numbers.
So I hear that. And we also know that this is an issue not like across the country. And we've seen it well documented, and it's not just something we're grappling here in Montgomery County. I guess this is more of a comment than a question. Since we now have this central traffic unit, is it called a unit? Or unit. One of the things that the police chief in Tacoma Park did, and I know you know this, in 2018, was shift how the city did traffic enforcement. And there were a number of things that were put in place. It's a much smaller, I get it. Tacoma Park is a much smaller area. But I think in terms of not just looking at enforcement, because it sounds like you're moving in that direction of what you're looking at, but one of the other things that the chief did at that time was also look at evaluations for police officers who were doing traffic stops, as well as following up periodically on why some stops were done, so to discourage sort of fishing expeditions. And my only comment would be, and I know you all know the chief in Tacoma Park, but now that you have this traffic unit, I think there could be some shared lessons learned in what happened there, since you have now a concentrated unit on this.
So, yeah, Well, a couple of things. Yes, as Captain Dillman pointed out, we have random review now with our body-worn cameras. We can certainly speak with the supervisors and ask them to have the same type of discussions with their officers concerning stops. But I hesitate when, if we equate, because I've heard people say, well, Tacoma Park reduced the number of traffic stops and then therefore they reduced the number of accidents. And I don't believe that to be true. If that's where you're headed, that we should model our traffic.
I just said, I think there are lessons learned.
Yeah, I agree.
In what we've done, or what the chief in Tacoma Park has done, and how he has iterated that. Particularly now that if Montgomery County has moved towards having a specific traffic unit, that there could be a good lessons learned in sharing there.
Sure.
Thank you. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Lutke.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. Some might be for you, some might be for you. One of the questions I had, or concerns, when reading the report was you used the term stop and search repeatedly throughout the report, but there's no data at all in this related to searches, and there's nothing to indicate that there were searches or what might have been yielded from those searches in this report. So I found that concerning that was not clarified or otherwise explained, but yet that phrase was used throughout the report. Could you explain?
Sure. I don't remember exactly where the term search was used. I believe it was in reference to the national research, so that was referenced in the report where that comes from. There is more data on searches in the previous report that we did in 2020 that has the information on how Black and Latinx drivers were searched at disproportionate rates. This data set is very, very rich. There are a lot of different ways to analyze it, and so in this particular case, I didn't look closely at searches.
Okay, but you would agree that there are a couple different ways that a search could in fact happen during a traffic stop, right?
Certainly, I mean, the MCPD would be the experts on that.
Right, but you can have it based on probable cause, you can have it based on a warrant, you can have it be done consensually, and it could be a search incident to arrest if in fact the traffic stop did yield an arrest, correct?
MCPD is the
Okay.
experts on that.
All right.
I'm shaking my head in agreement, yes.
Okay. The way it was pitched out there in the report made it seem nefarious when in fact there was not adequate explanation. So someone maybe who doesn't have a legal background may not understand that and may infer things that are not actually there or that were not explained within the data. And that, for me, in any kind of statistical analyses is significant, but also problematic because it wasn't appropriately caveated within the report. As I understand it, the race and ethnicity categories are specified by state law, and then they have not been updated for 22 years, right? And that the state data collection system, as you've noted, was that. And this is not unique to this particular subject. It happens within education data that the State Department of Education collects. I could tell you 1,000 times how many times I've asked for the Form 11 for hate crimes reporting to be updated to reflect the additional criminal statutes that have been added so that we're getting adequate and appropriate data on that, and MSP is still using a very old form. But there's nothing, and this came up because of some of the types of violations that are listed in there. There's nothing in there talking about the age of the individuals. And there are certain things within the list of problems, of course, related to licensing or registration, making sure you've got appropriate insurance. Right? I used to do insurance defense litigation way back when I first started practicing law. But things like a child safety seat and seatbelt requirements for children, obviously you can't tell if you're just observing a vehicle. That's not the reason you're stopping them. But if you're noticing that, and there's a child who's not properly restrained in the vehicle when you stop them, that's a significant public safety issue that we, as a matter of policy, want to be addressed because we want our children to be safe. But it would be useful to know whether these violations are occurring within particular ages of those individuals being stopped so that we can figure out what, from a policy directive or from an agency directive within the county, could be done to address those issues so that we are reducing the violations. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to reduce these things from happening in the first place. So I don't know if that's something that can be collected, but it is something that would be necessary in order to evaluate how to best treat the underlying problem at issue. And, you know, we were talking about automated traffic enforcement issue, speed cameras, failure to stop cameras, which do I want to say I love? I do love. I don't want tickets, but I do love them, and I think they're very effective, particularly in certain geographic areas and at certain intersections where failure to stop is an ongoing issue. And if we want to get to Vision Zero, we need to have those in place. But if we want to get to Vision Zero, and understanding we still cannot automate response to everything, you can't do automated traffic enforcement for non-speed violations, can you?
When we talk about, and Chief Yamada talked about focus on the 5, automated traffic enforcement is going to deal with one aspect of this 5, and that's speed. It is a great tool, but traffic enforcement by law enforcement is critical to be able to address those other 4 components.
And with respect to DUI, or driving while impaired or distracted, which when initially observing can the one and the same, right? Something's happening. The driver is not driving appropriately within the boundaries of the rules of the road. And as you gave your presentation, you referenced that and noted that they didn't know about the impairment until they did the stop. But I wasn't sure if you meant they didn't know why they were impaired, or that were you trying to say that the officers could not know or could not observe or determine that there was impairment or distraction of some kind that led to the stop? Because that was confusing.
Sure. So I looked at all of the different sections and worked with MCBD staff to identify which sections can be reasons for stops, and that was one that I identified as something that they have to really confirm during the stop, and they agreed with me in that determination.
So just make sure I understand. It's not that it's that it was confirmed following the stop, but the stop had to be initiated because there was a reasonable suspicion to believe that a driver was driving under the impaired or distracted that was creating a road safety issue. Is that correct? Okay.
You could even take it a step further. We've discussed, like, any stop involving impairment is the first thing you're pulling them over for is probably something that people might consider to be minor.
Mm-hmm.
But yes.
Okay. And there are no current field sobriety tests available for cannabis impairment, correct?
No. So for decades, law enforcement through NHTSA has taught the standardized field sobriety tests. These are primarily focused on alcohol impairment. There are sobriety tests out there that do focus on drug impairment. It's an additional course which we are working diligently to get all of our officers through. We are very concerned with the recreational use of marijuana coming to the state in July, that we will see an increase in impaired driving and impaired driving fatalities. It's important to note that the numbers that we have provided, about a third of all of our fatal car crashes involve impairment. However, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland does not test for cannabis when it comes to their toxicology reports. So while 30% of our traffic fatalities involve impairment, that number should presumably be larger than that. So we are working diligently to get our officers prepared for that.
And the reason being, Lieutenant, you tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's not been an overdose related to marijuana. That's what
The explanation given to us by the Chief Medical Examiner is that there is no need to test for THC because no individual has ever overdosed on cannabis. Concern that we also have is, as a nation, we have a standard for alcohol impairment. It's a 0.08. We have instruments that can go ahead and provide you a result. That certainly you're welcome to challenge in court, but we have instruments that are independent of law enforcement that are done through the state toxicologists. We do not yet have that for cannabis. And so that is, again, our concern when July 1 happens, that there may be an increased use of cannabis and driving.
And as I understand it, and this came up in the context of schools, right, in my prior work, but, you know, there were adverse incidents requiring emergency response at schools because of students who were vaping THC and suffered cardiac issues at the schools. So you're not necessarily, you know, we think about overdose in the context of the opioid epidemic and in that sense, but it doesn't mean that there aren't adverse medical episodes that can occur from this. And again, it depends on proportion. It depends on the individual human and how their body responds to it. But that there were not tests, and that there was, as I understood it at the time, something that you could send away to a lab in Pennsylvania. But that this was not something readily available, and it was highly expensive in order to do it.
Councilmember, you are correct. So there, like I said, there's been no fatal overdoses, but certainly people have had adverse reactions. It's a psychoactive drug. It will have an impact on individuals. Their blood pressure will go up. Their pulse rate will go up. People will have cardiac episodes. You know, we have had fatal collisions before. My previous assignment before I was in my current one is I led our fatal crash team for 4 years. We would have crashes where it was unclear why an individual took a certain action, and again, the toxicology result did not show any sort of impairment. We, as a department, take this very seriously. We would then send away for these to go to a private lab to show in terms of a nanogram level in an individual system. It's important to give a full picture, especially to a loved one's family, as to why a fatal car crash has occurred.
Did you want to go briefly into the percentages, like of the THC, what it used to be in the...
Oh, yeah.
So, with all advancements, there's an opportunity to increase the THC level. You can isolate it, and then what we've come into contact is a lot of the federal studies are done through the University of Mississippi. The THC content cannot exceed 14%. When we have done some of our own impaired driving cannabis labs through the department, we have had individuals had well over 90% THC. There's also a concern when it comes to edibles. With inhalation, there tends to be a bit of a bell curve where you can kind of track how someone's impairment will go. Typically, it's the highest in the first 20 to 30 minutes. With edible consumption, there can be a delayed onset, which is where we found a lot of our issues in the past, where an individual has consumed an edible amount of cannabis, did not get the desired effect, then took a second, and then realized that they were in a position where they could not function or operate a motor vehicle safely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Mink.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Wanted to just loop back and touch on something that you mentioned earlier to just clarify about the Stanford analysis of traffic stops. So that was an analysis by 21 state patrol agencies and 35 municipal police forces between 2011 and 2018, and it was looking at, and this is again in regards to a question that I think Councilmember or Chair Katz was getting at when you were mentioning how that it would be interesting to be able to get data from the cameras to figure out how much are these activities do the disparities reflect the realities of the drivers on the road versus something that we need to address on our end. So the study found that that police were less likely to pull over black drivers after dark when the driver's face is obscured. So, you know, it's hard to say exactly, to have data that will exactly answer those questions, but that was an effort to find one way to answer that question. And then I also wanted to loop back to the question about traffic stops, which I've heard from a lot of my colleagues up here and from you all as well, that we have a state issue that we need to address in our ability to have our officers recording the initial reason for the traffic stop prior to engaging with the civilian. And also wanted to, on the documentation side, as reflected in our data, and this is in response to Councilmember Balcom's question about the data around stops, that we do have a disparity in our data because of a discrepancy prior to, I think got cleared up in 2021 between in the FOP agreement, where it states that all traffic stops must be documented, but also that in the event that the officer does not issue a written document during a traffic stop, that the officer will provide the citizen with the officer's business card and verbally inform the citizen of the reason for the stop. So for officers who took that as, as that qualified as documentation, that would mean that our data did not reflect a number of those stops. So, and we're not sure, was that a few? Was that a ton? We just don't know because the data just doesn't exist. But it's an we should just have an awareness that there's some number of missing data points there. All right. So I wanted to take this in a little bit of a different direction and ask you all how you measure, what you use metrically to measure the success of your traffic enforcement operations.
So if we go by Vision Zero, we're not doing so good. We're not doing so good nationally. We are doing in Montgomery County better than the national average as far as the increase in bicycle fatalities, pedestrian fatalities, and overall traffic fatalities. I think we're doing a very good job if you look at the surveys that were done recently. Some of the calls that have taken place, inquiring from the Montgomery County residents what they wanted to see and how they wanted to see it. So I will admit to you, I have not done my job if you want to judge it by the Vision Zero number with our 43 fatalities last year.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that reflection. And and I'll just note that I think traditionally that has not been a metric that has been used by most police departments. Here in Montgomery County, we certainly have talked about how important Vision Zero is to us. And I think if we step back and look at what do we want our traffic enforcement to be doing, right? It is the primary goal is to make our streets safer, to reduce those accidents and those collisions. And so, the fundamental questions, we have a lot of other issues here, but the fundamental question around traffic enforcement, to me, is that Vision Zero question, which, and as you have said, we are seeing that our current efforts are not particularly effective in that measure. So, then we would look to say, well, what could make that better? Again, recognizing that Tacoma Park is different from Montgomery County, in a number of ways. It is a data point, a local data point that we have that did find that they had fewer collisions. Collisions were down about 20% between 2017 and 2019, which is the last year pre-pandemic, and of course the pandemic kind of threw all these data points for a loop. And that correlated with a dramatic reduction, 85% reduction in traffic stops. So, to me, that's a really interesting data point that if we can dig more deeply into that to figure out the whys there, that I think that there should be some lessons learned, to your point.
So if I could real quick
Please.
on the Tacoma Park thing, I think we have the numbers here. Maybe we can agree to disagree on the reduction in overall collisions based on these numbers, but you're comparing an area of 2.7 miles to Montgomery County, which is about 507, give or take. You're talking about Tacoma Park that has exactly one portion of one road that exceeds or equals 35 miles an hour. Every other road is underneath 35 miles an hour. So if you compared those two things, I think we're making a mistake, but I'll I'll let either Captain Dillman or Lieutenant Bryan cite the specific numbers for Tacoma Park and the reasons why I would say we might be in a position to disagree.
In a review of Tacoma Park's general orders, they talk about the goal of selective enforcement is to reduce traffic accidents and gain voluntary compliance. They define selective enforcement activities as based on accident data, enforcement calls, traffic volume, traffic conditions, and citizen complaints. In conversations that I've had with Chief Duvall, he has talked about how he has refocused his officers on this particular type of traffic enforcement. I would argue, Councilmember Mink, that we are doing the exact same thing. Our central traffic unit and our department overall has been pushing for the focus on the 5, as Chief Yamada has spoken about earlier. It's speed and or aggressive driving, it's impaired driving, it's occupant protection, it's pedestrian safety, it's distracted driving. We are doing the exact same thing. They have the luxury of being much smaller. As Chief Yamada pointed out, they're 2.4 square miles, we're 507 square miles. Based on the census, they are 17,000, we are over 1.1 million. So I think Council Member Stewart brought up earlier, which I think was a great point. Can we collaborate? Can we learn? 100%. But I do think we are doing the exact same thing.
And just to add to that, the numbers, I mean, Tacoma Park, the number of acres reports for collisions they wrote. Now, these are reportable accidents, so either there's property damage and the cars aren't drivable, or there's claims of personal injury. But in 2019, they had 179, 2020, 154. 2021, 171, and 2022, 165. So between 21 and 22, you're seeing a reduction of 6 traffic collisions that they wrote. So, yeah, I just would caution us by looking at them to use them as a model. And just going back to Vision Zero, goals are good. Without goals, we're lost. But I have a problem with Vision Zero because if we're aiming for perfection, there's not one of us in this room that's perfect. And we're trying to combat human behavior, and we're just not going to be able to make sure that we prevent every single person from getting in a car. And quite frankly, some of the legislation that's passed, if you think we're going to get to Vision Zero, passing marijuana laws that now you don't need a marijuana card, but you can use it recreationally, and we're going to get to Vision Zero, we are kidding ourselves in this room. It's not going to happen.
I'll just add on to that too. It reminded me of something I missed, but you know, we're dealing with infrastructure here in Montgomery County, roadway infrastructure, that if you were able to fly around the earth backwards and turn back time like Superman, we would be woefully behind the 8 ball infrastructure-wise 50 years ago. And now with all the advancements in, you know, you talk about speed and the amount of traffic and still having the same infrastructure, that's a tough how do we judge success on that? That makes it even tougher. So.
Yeah, thank you for all of your feedback on those different aspects of how we need to think about this. With respect to the fact that I acknowledge certainly that Tacoma Park and Montgomery County are different in a wide variety of ways, right? What I'm looking at is that our job here, we're talking about traffic enforcement, our job is to make the road safer, our cumulative job, right? We have to, Vision Zero is hard, it's a vision, right? We're not getting to zero tomorrow. But our collective goal together, you know, needs to be to reduce the number of accidents and to make our roads safe. We have a lot of, you know, tangential goals, obviously, but when we're talking about traffic enforcement, the responsibility here is how can we make our roads safer for cars, for pedestrians, for, you know, for the residents of our county, right? And I think we can all agree to that, right? That's kind of our fundamental goal here. And so, you know, as we have seen, we're not doing that here in Montgomery County. There's a lot of responsibilities and things that we have to address that aren't under the purview of the police department, infrastructure and otherwise to achieve Vision Zero. But, you know, we are right now putting a lot on you to say that we need you to be helping us to drive those goals right now as well. So with those numbers not being where they are, we are falling short and we are, you know, going to work on that. You know, the methodology of what we're doing on the police department side also is also falling short, I would say. You know, we're not getting there overall. So, you know, my question then is, what models can we find? Where can we turn to find folks who are doing something with enforcement that is working better than what we have now? And I think that's a responsibility that we have to the public, is to make sure that we are using those metrics. And I'm curious if at this point, if you all have, or if the police department has any concrete goals for traffic enforcement as related to Vision Zero. I mean, like specific goals. We're not, not saying get to zero tomorrow. And we can and should ask this question of ourselves as well. But, something tangible like, reduce accidents by X% along, the Route 29 corridor or anything like that. Something to help kind of drive that mission towards Vision Zero.
I mean, we're constantly evaluating what we're doing with Wade Holland, the Vision Zero director. I mean, when you start trying to ask for specific numbers as goals, it's a discussion that he and I and my team have had. It's very, we tread cautiously when we do that. I can point out to you that when we first started this, we had 48 traffic officers at our 6 district stations, and now I have 26 in Central. So what Brian and I, and John and the rest of us are trying to figure out is, especially in the area of pedestrian enforcement, how do we improve that? We keep saying enforcement, and I try to stress the word education, because I think that's going to be a huge part of this, to focus strictly on the enforcement aspect, especially when it comes to pedestrians and bicyclists. That only leads to a confrontation that's going to result in a use of force or an arrest, something unnecessary. So those are pedestrian enforcement, or pedestrian education and enforcement, bicycle safety. Those are the areas that Brian and I are going to try to figure out how we can do this. We're going to collaborate with other agencies if need be. We'd be more than happy to look at other models to follow, anything like that. If you have suggestions for us, we're all ears, because I think we're all in a place now where anytime my pager goes off after about 8 o'clock at night, I always cringe, because I'm thinking it's another fatality.
I think it's something, I think honesty and transparency is very important. And one thing I want to point out to you, in 2019, as an agency, we had 106,080 traffic stops as an agency. That same year, we had 33 fatalities. You look at last year, we had 46 fatalities. We were down 68% in traffic stops to under 36,000 as an agency. We've got to get re-engaged in traffic enforcement. And it's a cultural thing. We had, in 2020, as everyone knows, we had the tragic George Floyd incident. We had the pandemic. And our officers were told not to engage because of the pandemic. We needed to make sure we remained healthy. So we were making traffic stops if it was needed. And since that time, because of what's happened politically, because of some of the rhetoric, we have had a very difficult time getting officers re-engaged in traffic enforcement. And if you think that those numbers haven't increased because of lack of traffic enforcement, we've emboldened people to drive the way they've been driving because they don't have that deterrent effect. I would argue our automated traffic enforcement, awesome tool, but a $40 fine, there's very little bite to that to deter people's behavior in terms of speeding. So there's a lot we have to deal with. As an agency, we're down 127 officers. Our calls for service are up. So we're forced to be having officers running calls for service versus focusing on traffic enforcement. Conversely, like the chief said, we went from 48 officers stationed throughout the 6 districts to do traffic enforcement down to 26. So there's a whole lot of things that we need to do. We can do better as an agency, and we're looking at that. But re-engaging in traffic enforcement is a huge thing we need to do.
And one other thing I can point out, the new contract for our ATU, our automated traffic, allows for expansion. So we'll be able to expand the number of speed cameras and red light cameras. Is that going to be the answer? Unfortunately, no, but it should help.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is I mean, so were you referring to, data that shows that the number of stops correlates with fewer collisions?
I can't. I don't have all the answers. I wish I did. What I'm saying is, in my professional opinion, I can't help but to think when we're out there enforcing traffic, when we do 106,000 traffic stops, and we have 33 fatalities. Conversely, this past year, we had under 36,000 stops, 46 fatalities. I think there might be a correlation there with people
Councilmember Mink, I would also like to point out that the police department has worked with the Department of Transportation and the Vision Zero coordinator, Wade Holland, on doing periodic review of all of our fatal car crashes. We bring these 3 different groups together to see if there are different roadway or engineering issues that we can start to work on together. I am proud to point out that I believe Old Georgetown Road has become a much safer roadway for our vulnerable road users and our pedestrians and cyclists. So that is something that we're doing quarterly, meeting with them, seeing what sort of issues we can proactively identify now and work with other stakeholders.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I don't want to take up too much time. I feel like I'm dominating the conversation here, but I'll just mention that you raised a good point also about staffing, and we need to be really, really efficient because we have limited numbers of officers. And so that's also part of why it's important for us to be digging in here today and to really think about where do each of our officers, where do we most want, where are we getting the most bang for our buck? Where are we utilizing our officers where we don't have somebody else or a camera or something else that we could be using instead, because we have, again, a limited number of resources. We're seeing the numbers start to tick up, but we have to be really smart about it. And so, for example, with we've heard about how traffic stops can be a tool in removing guns from the streets, which is true. At the same time, from the perspective of efficiency, it takes about 2,360 stops for each gun seized here. And so, there's questions to be had about a matter of efficiency.
So I'm going to let Commander McBain chime in here, but I would, again, respectfully agree to disagree on the number of stops that's needed to take a gun off the street.
Appreciate that. So just to, I look at this from a perspective of the 3rd District Commander. Just one single team of Sergeant Corporal and 5 police officers. For 10 months since last March, they conducted 1,350 stops. They seized 30 firearms. So I think that would show you that it's not 2,000. More importantly, that unit itself has seized 36 firearms in 10 months. And I pulled a report this morning, and 6 of those firearms were used in incidents in D.C. So the fact that we're getting these firearms off the street through traffic stops, I think is making a huge impact on the safety, especially in my district, specifically to downtown Silver Spring.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, I'm not sure how you got that number, but last year we conducted 35,945 traffic stops, of which we had 172 firearms seized from those traffic stops. So if you do the math, it's 1 firearm on every 209 traffic stops. And I would say that they're the ones that we're getting. There's a lot that we're stopping. And for example, our central traffic officers, they are so centrically focused, and all officers focus on different types of enforcement, but our traffic officers are focused predominantly on traffic offenses, aren't doing that dive to look for any criminal activity. So those numbers would actually be a lot lower if officers were focusing on criminal activity. So last year it was one gun seized every 209 traffic stops.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so my numbers were from the PAC report, and I'm happy to go back and look at how you
I think what happened is the PAC report keeps saying that the #1 contact police have in Montgomery County with its residents on traffic stops, because they keep pulling the 2019 data, which is the last time we did over 100,000 traffic stops. Like I said, last year we were under 36,000.
Thank you. My last question that I'll leave you with is I just wanted to get your perspective on if there was any pieces in particular, any pieces in the OLO report that we're meeting here about that you all found as cause for reflection or particular areas of concern, or like I'm hearing that some things are that you're seeing are just reflect disparities that might exist in real life. So I'm curious about if there are aspects of the OLO report that are not that.
I'll just say it was talked about a little bit, but when you're looking at when you're using a number like 18 or 19% of African American drivers in the county, that would suggest that no one comes into the county and no one leaves. And when I specifically, again, I'm speaking from a district level, but when I'm specifically looking at 6 areas of Silver Spring, I have areas like White Oak, which is 53% African American, Calverton, which is 52%. I mean, the list goes on. So, all I would say to the council is, I think look at the numbers a little more. I don't think using a census number of 19% or 18% is doing the data justice. It's far more dramatic. If you look at where all of our carjacked vehicles are ending up, it's Prince George's County and D.C. We see a lot of cross-jurisdictional crime, and I think that trends with our drivers at specific times of the day and night, especially in a district like Silver Spring, which borders D.C. and PG County.
One of the things that I took away, I know it was in the ELE 4A report. I'm not so sure it was in the OLO. Could have been. Regardless, they suggested that we, as our officers on a random review, did not allow people who were stopped for traffic violations to have a voice, meaning the officers might have greeted them, whatever, but didn't have the time to say, did you have a reason why you were going so fast, or is there a reason why you weren't wearing your seatbelt? So one of the things I've worked out with Brian is that's what we're stressing with our officers, the consistency in the way the stops are done, what the officer says, how they say it, and most importantly, because that was pointed out, we need to make sure that we afford whoever is stopped with the opportunity to give a reason why they were doing whatever it is they were doing.
In any report, I think it forces us to look within. This report does the same thing, but what I can tell you is that if we want to be honest with ourselves and if we want to really make progress, we have to look not in the lens of just this tunnel vision with this LL report with respect to traffic stops. We need to look at everything globally in terms of crime and everything else. There are disparities across the board with crime as well. And if we're going to have honest conversations about things, it's much bigger than what we're talking about here. Our goal, and everyone on this table here has been in law enforcement for 30 plus years. We took on this job because we wanted to make the streets safer, whether it be traffic safety or whether it be criminal activity. We take it seriously. And what I've also had the luxury to do because of my former roles within the department is I've visited departments all over the country. I've trained with departments all over the country. This is a very good department. And if you look at these situations that are happening all over the country, what's very difficult for us to hear is we get captured in the broad brush of actions of others. And what I can say proudly with this department, have we made mistakes? Are any of us perfect out here? Absolutely not. Could we do things better? We could. But all in all, as an agency, you don't see these things happening that are happening in Memphis, happening in Minnesota here in this department. Does that mean we're impervious from something like that happening? No. We're always striving to do our best. And I think there's a lot of additional conversation need to take place so that we can collectively, as a body, address these issues in a much deeper dive than just this meeting.
Okay.
Thank you, Captain. Thank you very much, Councilmember Mink. Appreciate the conversation, right? Because what we are doing today is grounding ourselves in the data, and I think there's agreement that the data are not exhaustive, and there's always room for going deeper, trying to capture more information, asking the state to provide us or allow us to capture more information. But on the other side, talking about Vision Zero, there are pieces of data that are measurable and tragic, and in 2022, last year, there were 574 pedestrians and bicyclists who were injured, 19 people killed, and in this year alone, 5 weeks into this calendar year, there are already 55 pedestrians and bicyclists hit and 2 fatal injuries, one just last night in Aspen Hill. And it is the data that we're talking about in the worldview, in the holistic approach, that will inform us how we have to move forward.
I could just say something too, the data too. Understand that what we're combating is to try to save the lives of people of color, because all 4 of our fatal accidents this year are people of color, and that's important. And what I would invite all you guys, and it's interesting, but in 2022, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration published this report evaluating disparities in traffic fatalities by race, ethnicity, and income. It's a good report, so I would encourage you guys to read it.
Road safety or lack thereof disproportionately affects communities of color, absolutely. And joining us also for this conversation is Councilmember Sales, and I invite her to make some comments.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Okay, thank you, Chairman Glass and Chairman Katz for convening this discussion. And I also want to thank our staff, Natalia, for putting the report together to give us a baseline of data to discuss. I come from the city of Gaithersburg municipality, and so not all municipalities have law enforcement departments, and so due to understaffing and what's happening across the nation, I do want to thank you all for being here and want to commend you all for working in public safety as well, given the understaffing and increased reliance on accountability and transparency and otherwise. So I did have a few follow-up questions in addition to what some of my colleagues have shared. As a member of the Health and Human Services Committee, there is inherent risks in traffic enforcement, and so we want to ensure that you are able to do your jobs at the best of your ability. And so wanted to ask about the revenue, if there's any information about the revenue that comes from traffic enforcement. I know it goes to the state. Do we have any idea of what comes back to jurisdictions and how that money is reinvested back? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Traffic enforcement gets sent to the state and then gets redistributed evenly throughout the state.
And how is that just in the regular base of the budget, or is it put back into law enforcement, public safety, or road infrastructure?
It's the general fund.
General fund.
Into the general fund. And then Chris can talk about automated traffic enforcement if you want.
Yes.
Yeah, automated traffic enforcement, all of our funding, we keep what we need as an agency to pay the contractors, and then the rest goes into the general fund, which is earmarked for public safety.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. And I don't think this was in the report, but do we know about additional data regarding further enforcement after a moving violation, regarding the tickets, arrests, or use of force complaints after a moving violation or a traffic stop? Do we have any data? So after someone is stopped, how many result in a ticket or further enforcement? I know there were questions about search and seizure or any arrests or use of force complaints.
So, yes, the data set does include information on searches, and I believe it also has information on arrests. That wasn't a focus of this report, but I was just looking back, and I did put some summary data in here about searches. So for the stops that occurred in this 5-year period, which were a total of about 376,000 stops, there were 30,000 searches and 22,000 arrests listed in the data set.
Okay. And do we have the demographics and the end result? Like, were those cases guilty? Were they thrown out, or?
So we don't have the end result. In the report, I have the demographic breakdown for the searches and arrests. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide on that, but what I can read it to you right now if you want. So for searches, Asian drivers accounted for 3%, Black drivers accounted for 43%, Latinx drivers accounted for 31%, white drivers accounted for 21%, and drivers categorized as other accounted for 3%. And then for arrests, Asian drivers accounted for 3%, Black drivers accounted for 38%, Latinx drivers accounted for 35%, white drivers accounted for 21%, and drivers categorized as other were accounted for 3% of arrests.
Okay. And so I know that the officers mentioned not to use census data for the reports. What other demographic data should we be referencing in these reports?
I don't have any suggestions on what to use. I would look at what has been done elsewhere, but I can, from what I've read and seen, very few, if any, rely on census data to conduct these.
Okay. Well, I'm open to recommendations of what other data sources are used, because we want to be as accurate as possible and not biased by any data sources. You mentioned the geography and equity areas for surveillance. Do we have any data about zip code data?
Not in this report. I know that there's certainly an interest in that, and as usual, if there's a request for more data, we can see if we can develop a project on that.
And do we know any data regarding Montgomery County residents versus residents who don't live in the county? Did we account for that in the data?
Sure. So not in this slide, but in here we go. So this is just the overall breakdown of who was involved, what the residency of the driver. So a little bit under 3/4 were Montgomery County residents, and then this is the breakdown by race and ethnicity. And if you look in the middle, is the Montgomery County residents.
Okay, thank you. And then I read that I thought it was the county recently conducted a cannabis study. Are you all aware of that study?
So,
Do we know?
Lieutenant O'Brien is one of our cannabis labs. It's
Okay,
like we're at
good.
the forefront nationally when it comes to that, and I'll let Lieutenant O'Brien speak.
Councilmember, we just concluded our 10th cannabis lab. The cannabis lab is modeled after the NHTSA-approved alcohol labs. Those have been used for decades to train officers and to identify alcohol impairment. Back in 2017, my colleague, Officer Jamie Derbyshire, was concerned about with the introduction of medical marijuana and what that would mean for our road safety. So starting in 2018, we worked with our local dispensaries to utilize medical marijuana card holders to participate in a cannabis lab. These individuals would come to the police academy, they would have 2 controlled dosings of cannabis, and then officers would get to see real-time impairment right afterward. It was important for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, I think for the longest time, the cannabis community and the law enforcement community have been very adversarial. That's how I would describe the relationship. So it's an opportunity to explain to officers, these individuals require medical cannabis so they can be productive members of society. Just because you smell it doesn't mean you should seize it or doesn't mean you should tow their vehicle. Alternatively, it also showed some of our cannabis users that because I do need this to be productive, but maybe I cannot operate a motor vehicle safely after utilizing it. We partnered with Morgan State University with their driving simulator, which was brought down to, again, show cannabis consumers how their reactions can be delayed. I will say this was the first ever in the nation sponsored cannabis event by a law enforcement agency. The Montgomery County Police Department was recently awarded a NACO award last year for innovative law enforcement for this very project. So I think, again, I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned about our roadways. In particular, I live here in Montgomery County. I work here in Montgomery County. I want to make sure that we are very safe. I do think we are taking steps. I am very concerned about what cannabis how that will affect our roadway safety. But again, what we are trying to do is get every officer on our department exposed to this, get them more robust field training that would help you identify a cannabis impaired driver versus just an alcohol impaired driver. So I'm confident that we are making large strides in that. I just know that we are kind of fighting against time.
I don't want to volunteer work for anybody, but I know Lieutenant O'Brien would be, and Jamie Derbyshire, Officer Derbyshire, would be happy to come in and speak with the council on the ins and outs. They just did some training for the County Bar Association.
The Inns of Montgomery County, we just did a presentation for them as well as the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. Again, of these 10 that we've held, 8 have been for law enforcement officers, not only from Montgomery County, but also our neighboring jurisdictions, because as Commander McBain pointed out, we do have a lot of cross-county travel. It's important that our colleagues in Prince George's County, Howard County, know the signs and sites of impairment when it comes to cannabis. But we've also done it for the State's Attorney's Office, not only just for Montgomery County, but throughout the state, because we think it's very, very important. As we've talked about before, our body-worn cameras are a fantastic tool for us. They can show an individual's behavior, but it's also important to understand that cannabis impairment can dissipate after a few hours. And so we were hoping to show some of our state's attorneys so they could see it 20 minutes after consumption. This is how this individual was having a hard time with their motor skills.
And do you have any, data or results from the previous labs that have been conducted to, demonstrate the sort of impairment? And have you seen that exhibited during traffic stops since the passage of the medical marijuana?
So yes, we have seen, we've been able to train officers so they can identify someone who is driving under the influence of drugs. We essentially have 2 different categories of driving under the influence. We have the DUI, which is the 21902A and B, which is the alcohol, and then you have C and D, which is drugs. It is important to note the way that our state's attorney's office works is if an individual submits to an evidentiary test and shows that they are above the legal limit for alcohol, there is no secondary test to see if cannabis is also involved as well. So I will say that our DUID numbers are held relatively steady over the last few years, but again, they are much smaller compared to our alcohol driving under the influence arrests.
Okay, but no trends have been, noticed or reported during traffic stops that you're aware of?
Well, unfortunately, what I can say is that our driving under the influence numbers have decreased over the last few years. But unfortunately, our fatal car crashes with impairment have increased. So unfortunately, I don't think that the impaired drivers aren't still out there. I think it's important that we, again, have our officers, recommitted to doing traffic enforcement, as Captain Dillman talked about, because we've certainly seen, how that can impact. As you've already mentioned, last year we had 42 fatal car crashes, which took the life of 46 individuals here in Montgomery County. That's our highest since 2008. I'd also point out that over 42% of those car crashes involved speed. A third of those involved impairment. And so these are the dangerous driving behaviors that we have all seen when we operate on roadways here in Montgomery County. Unfortunately, with the pandemic and a lot more teleworking that's gone on, that natural slowing down mechanism of other vehicles on the roadway are no longer there. And now we've seen what happens when individuals who like to engage in very dangerous driving behaviors and what sort of tragic outcomes we can have.
So of those impaired incidents, we don't know how many have been attributed to cannabis or a drug versus alcohol impairment or distracted driving.
I can tell you again, 30% of our fatal car crashes last year involved an impairment. And in terms of alcohol versus drug, that would be something I'd have to get with you to follow up with you.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if it was distracted driving because they're using a cell phone or, some other sort of technology, or if it was alcohol or any cannabis-related incidences. As we're, we just heard about the legislation for cannabis, so almost 100 pages that has been introduced in Annapolis, and so it's good to get ready for this, population that's going to come.
If I may, what I can tell, I can't give you the whole year's numbers, but what I can tell you is a snapshot of an 8-week period of time for our holiday task force. Pretty staggering numbers. They arrested 291 drivers for DUI. Of those 291, 8 of those were drug related only. Not alcohol and drug, but drug related only. Important thing to note too, of those 291 collisions, there were 38 that involved crashes, of which 5 were striking marked police vehicles in the performance of their duties while having their lights activated, one of which was occupied by a police officer. So in the days of the move-over law that took effect October 1st, police out doing their job with their lights activated, 5 of those were struck while by impaired drivers. So we have a definite issue with impaired drivers. And that was just an 8-week period of time.
I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. A number of colleagues just have a few more comments to make. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. Assistant Chief Yamada, I want to get back to the census data because I think I understand what you're talking about. So if we look at the chart up here and we see adult population, the percentages are there. That's what you're talking about. We're comparing this to census numbers, correct? And what I'm hearing you say is in the last couple of years, we now have a central traffic unit that is doing much more targeted traffic enforcement in certain areas, particularly overlaying with our equity emphasis areas in our community. So the question is, can we look at the data so that we are comparing apples to apples and making sure that, one, we know why those areas are being targeted? Obviously, I believe, but we should state this, that there are more collisions there or issues that we want to address in traffic enforcement, and then look at each of those areas and seeing if there are disparities.
But just so you guys have the proper picture painted, we have crime analysts, we have a traffic analyst. They plot where all of our collisions are. They plot where our fatal accidents are. And then they spit out a document to our central traffic as well as our district commanders every 2 weeks to say, here's those areas. And that's where we deploy our central traffic.
Yes, thank you, Lieutenant Dillman, I understand that. But I think, Assistant Chief, is that where, did I get that right? Okay. So I think, sorry, when you mentioned it earlier, I wasn't fast enough. But I think I get the question you're raising now, and I think that is something to go back to OLO because I think that would be important to have a supplemental report on.
Here's the other thing for you all to keep in mind. Those high incident areas where Captain Dillman's saying that the traffic data is showing the majority of our collisions, they're the same now that they were 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I also want to follow up on a point that you made, which I think was really important, that meeting our Vision Zero goal should not and cannot fall squarely on the shoulders of traffic enforcement because we have huge infrastructure problems in our communities. And our communities were, many of them, designed for cars and not for pedestrian or bicyclists. So it is also incumbent upon us to look at that infrastructure changes we need to make. So, yeah.
I mean, my biggest challenge is the pedestrian and the bicyclist. I'm asking officers to go out and either conduct directed enforcement or education on pedestrians and bicyclists. The quickest way to start an argument or a fight with somebody is to tell them they're not crossing the street right or they're not riding their bicycle correctly. It always ends poorly. So I'm desperately trying to figure out how I can reach those two communities. You know, we send out public service announcements. We've handed out flyers before, but how do we reach them short of giving them a ticket for not crossing where they're supposed to cross or not? How many bicyclists I've seen blow right through a stop sign or ignore a traffic light. They want to be a vehicle when it comes to certain things, but not all the times. And it's like my biggest struggle.
Well, it's getting late in the day. I'm not sure we're going to solve that problem today, but I'm hoping my colleagues on public safety may take this up, and this may be something that we decide is this education and outreach is not something for law enforcement to be doing, but someone else to be doing, as we're all working as a whole community to meet that Vision Zero goal. So I just want to thank you all for coming today and the conversation we've had. Thank you.
And I just want to pick up on the point that Councilmember Stewart just referenced about the zip code and the utility of that. It's my presumption also that the reason that you are cautioning against the zip code information is because I'm looking at the chart, because 27% of these infractions are from people outside of the county. Just wanting to understand that. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Balcom.
Yes, thank you. I did ditto on both the demographics and the infrastructure. I think from the census perspective, I work closely with the census for the past two, 2010 and 2020. So I think it's getting it down to mapping the demographics to where these equity issues are with respect to the people who don't live in Montgomery County. But I do think that we're going to look at different areas closer to the boundaries are going to have more. That would even be interesting to see where those infractions take place of people who are outside the county. I think that's really would provide a really rich look at comparing apples to apples is one. And similarly with infrastructure issues in the Up County, if we could, turn back time and recreate our communities based on pedestrian safety, we can't do that, so now we need to retrofit. And while they're not doing donuts in the middle of Germantown, they are drag racing on Great Seneca Highway. So I think we need to do that. I just wanted to clarify with Captain Dillman, the issue of the initial reason for the stop. It sounds like when you enter the data goes in. Is there any way, do we have the capacity to flag it somehow as the initial reason for the stop?
And again, that's the fight we have to fight with the states. There's a drop-down menu that comes on that says primary stop, but the second you put multiple offenses in there, it defaults to the very first one. So it might not be the primary one, but it might be the first one you wrote. So we're not getting accurate data as to what was the primary reason for that particular stop.
Okay, thank you, because I thought I heard you said you could put primary, but I didn't catch that nuance. So that clearly is a software state issue.
Sorry. I could probably just see a screenshot of somebody's phone and this would make sense. But okay, so you put it in as the initial reason for the stop, and then when you add more offenses, it resorts it. So then
Yes, Councilmember Mink, the initial screen that you're using for e-tics will have the most common traffic charges that are used on there. And so oftentimes what happens with officers is that the first ones they see are the ones they start clicking on. If there were charges that they had to look up because it was specifically nuanced to the behavior that they saw, something they would have to search for. How the program is set up is it will now default when it comes to the primary reason for stop for whatever the first charge you clicked on. And so the officers should be dropping down and cycling all the way through to find the actual reason for the stop. But if it was one of those more nuanced violations or observations, one that you had to search for, it will be much further down in the pecking order.
So for primary means, what does primary mean in the context of
It would be the behavior or the action taken by the driver that caused the officer to initiate the traffic stop.
Okay, so do they typically fill that out after the stop has concluded then, or?
No, ma'am, this is going on while the stop is still going on.
Okay, because we want to know the very first thing that caught their attention, and so if we're training our officers to always put that as the primary thing before they go in and engage, right? Because it's whatever they observed that caused them to, before they engage even with the member of the public, then anything that they add, after their engagement would be not labeled as the primary.
Yeah, I would say the only issue with that, council member, is that, when you initiate the traffic stop, the first things they're going to ask you to input is your driver information. So again, that wouldn't be able to happen until I've already made that first contact with the driver. I've gotten that driver's license and registration and any other sort of documentation they're going to provide, either a rental agreement or insurance or whatever they may want to provide. I've then gone back to my vehicle. I've uploaded the driver information. I've uploaded the vehicle information. Now it comes time to upload the violation information. Again, it's very similar to all the articles that were displayed up here by OLO. Those ones are usually up there as well, the most common ones, the speeding, the negligent driving, the seatbelt. But for example, if you were trying to find something about a handheld device, that one may not be on that primary screen. You would have to go search for it. So while I may have seen an individual operating a motor vehicle using their handheld device and then subsequently, upon the traffic stop, I also discovered they were suspended. The suspended one is going to be something that's going to appear immediately on my screen. I will have to search for the handheld device.
Gotcha. So is it possible to enter, to like skip that first screen and enter the, I mean, this is, we'd be asking, trying to get everybody, but I'm just wondering the logistics of it. On the technical side, is it possible for them to enter the primary reason for stop before getting the license and inputting the driver information, or is it not possible?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Last comments from us for today will be from Councilmember Sales.
Thank you, President Glass. Just wanted to follow up on something that Councilmember Stewart mentioned, because if we're looking at tracking data and trends in these equity areas, and we're seeing some trends about certain violations that are, constantly recurring, I would love to follow up on ways that we can better educate our pedestrians and drivers in those areas, and start with those high incident areas to make sure that they are better informed about the proper road instruction, navigation, and usage, because, a lot of our work in public health and eliminating disparities is in prevention and education. And so whether it's a language barrier or understanding, if there's a way that we can couple that with education and how we can help raise awareness, that would be helpful for us to learn and ascertain where those priority areas are for us to start.
Thank you. Well, really good conversation, and clearly this is just part one, because there's a lot more information that I'm hearing from my colleagues and I that will likely request OLO. Whether or not it means that we have to ask the state to assist us with getting some of that information. We will have those conversations subsequently, but at the end of the day, it is about the data, and it's about using that data to best protect all of our residents. And I think there is common universal agreement on that, and we'll continue this conversation to see how we best achieve that. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.